There are people who have been watching you struggle and they have been enjoying it. Not simply observing from the neutral distance of uninvested bystanders who happen to be peripherally aware of the difficulties your life has been navigating and who process that awareness with the detached sympathy of people for whom the struggle is someone else's reality and therefore carries no particular emotional significance, actively enjoying it, deriving a specific privately celebrated, carefully concealed satisfaction from the spectacle of a life that was moving towards something significant being arrested, reversed, or reduced to a condition that appears to confirm what they were privately convinced of all along, that the vision was too large for the vessel carrying it, that the calling was too ambitious for the person claiming it, that the confidence in divine promise was the elaborate, publicly performed self-deception of someone who fundamentally misread what God had actually designated for them and who would eventually be exposed by the very circumstances that were now, to the quiet satisfaction of those watching, beginning to do exactly that. People who smiled at your advancement when you were watching them and celebrated your setback the moment you were not. People who attended your beginnings, witnessed your public declaration of what God had spoken over your future, observed the faith with which you stepped toward the promise and filed every detail of it away as the evidence they would eventually point to when the future they were privately predicting arrived to confirm their assessment and vindicate their long-held verdict about the realistic limits of what was actually possible for a life like yours. People who are not your enemies in the obvious, confrontational sense that would make the opposition identifiable and therefore navigable, but who occupy the more complicated and more damaging position of being present enough in your life to witness the struggle, connected enough to the circles where your name operates to shape how others interpret it, and privately invested enough in the outcome they predicted to take a satisfaction in your difficulty that they would never openly admit, and that you would struggle to prove if asked to demonstrate it with the kind of evidence that external observers would find convincing. The mocking voice operates in example. Exactly this space, the space between what is openly said and what is privately felt, between the publicly performed neutrality and the privately celebrated schadenfreude, between the face presented in your presence and the assessment shared in your absence. It is one of the most specifically targeted and most comprehensively damaging weapons the enemy deploys against forward movements, precisely because it attacks not the circumstances of the progress, but the interior conditions that make the progress possible. Faith, courage, the willingness to continue declaring what God said in the face of the gap between the declaration and the current visible manifestation. The capacity to keep advancing toward the promise when the circumstances are providing those who doubted the promise with exactly the ammunition they were waiting for. The mocking voice says what it says in the full knowledge of when it will do the most damage, and the timing of its loudest expression is never accidental. It does not mock most aggressively at the beginning of the journey, when the promise is freshly received and the faith sustaining the forward movement is at its most energized and the person advancing toward what God declared is most insulated against discouragement by the vitality of the initial encounter with the promise. The mocking voice is strategically patient. It saves its most focused, most pointed, most damage maximizing expression for the specific moments of setback, for the seasons of public difficulty, of visible reversal, of the apparent arrest of progress that was supposed to be further along by now. It waits for the gap between the promise and the present to be wide enough, visible enough, and documented enough by the circumstances that those who have been watching can point to it with the confidence of people whose prediction appears to be receiving confirmation from the evidence that is accumulating in the public dimensions of the life they have been monitoring. And then it speaks into that gap with the specific framing that causes the maximum internal damage. Not simply the external observation that things have not gone according to the declared plan. The internal suggestion that the plan was never what it was declared to be. That the promise was not genuine. That the faith was misplaced. That the gap between what was declared and what has manifested is not the temporary condition of a journey still in progress, but the permanent evidence of a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of the God being trusted and the authenticity of the calling being pursued. The mocking voice uses the gap as its primary instrument, not because the gap is evidence of what the mocking voice says it is, but because the gap in the season when it is widest and most visible is the moment when the interior of the life being mocked is most vulnerable to the specific damage that the mocking voice is specifically designed to produce. That damage is the silencing of the declaration, the retreat from the public expression of the promise, the hedging of the faith into a defensive qualification that protects the person under mockery from providing further ammunition to those who are monitoring. The gap, but that also removes from the atmosphere of the life the very declaration that was activating the progress the mockery was celebrating the arrest of. The mocking voice wins its most significant victory not when it produces external consequences for the reputation or the relationships of the person it targets. It wins when it succeeds in silencing the tongue that was declaring the promise when the person who received the vision retreats from the bold, unqualified, God-honoring public declaration of what was spoken over them into the silence of a faith that has been made too self-conscious by the audience of mockers to speak with the freedom and the authority that the declaration requires to do its activating work. Psalm 35 was written by David from inside exactly this experience, the lived, specific, personally devastating experience of a man whose God-ordained progress had encountered sufficient, visible setback to provide those who are watching with the ammunition the mocking voice requires, and who cried out to God with the specific, legally informed, militarily precise invocation of divine contending that the mockery demanded a response to. Not a general cry for help, not a vague appeal to divine goodness. The specific invocation of the God who pleads the cause, who fights the fight, who takes the shield and the buckler and draws the spear, the God who enters the specific battle against the specific mocking voices with the full force of the divine warrior who does not observe the persecution of his covenant child's ordained progress. From a distance, but contends for it personally, actively, and with the comprehensive engagement of one who takes the mocking of what he declared as the direct challenge to his own faithfulness that it has always been. That invocation is being released right now over every mocking voice, every gathered rejoicing, every privately celebrated setback that has been accumulating against the progress of a life that God declared, and that the contending God of Psalm 35 is arising to advance past every obstacle the mockery erected against it. The voices that laughed at the progress have met the God who declared it, and the God who declared it is not amused. Psalm 35 opens with an invocation that is unlike any other opening in the Psalter. Plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler and stand up for my help. Also draw out the spear and stop those who pursue me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Read those words with the full attention they deserve, because they are not the words of someone composing a carefully measured, theologically balanced prayer from a position of spiritual comfort and emotional equilibrium. They are the words of someone in the middle of a battle that has become unbearable, who has reached the specific moment of desperate, faith-saturated, covenant-invoking cry that every person navigating sustained mockery of their God-ordained progress eventually reaches the moment when the accumulated weight of the mocking voices, the gathered rejoicing of those who predicted the failure, and the internal damage that the sustained mockery has been doing to the faith and the courage and the forward-moving willingness have combined to produce a pressure that the person under the attack cannot absorb alone, and that the God of covenant was always intended to be specifically invoked to address. The invocation of Psalm 35 is not general. This is the first and most important thing to understand about it, because a general invocation of God's goodness into a general experience of difficulty produces a general response that addresses the general dimension of the problem while leaving the specific dimensions of it untouched and therefore still operative. The invocation of Psalm 35 is specific in its language, specific in its targets, specific in the divine engagements it calls into action, and specific in the outcomes it declares. Every word of it was chosen by the Holy Spirit to do a specific thing in the spiritual atmosphere surrounding the life. and the calling that the mocking voice has been targeting, and the believer who deploys it with understanding deploys it with the precision of a legal advocate presenting a specific case before a specific court with specific evidence, rather than the imprecision of someone making a general emotional appeal to a distant authority and hoping for a broadly positive response. Plead my cause, and the word plead here is drawn from the legal vocabulary of the ancient world, from the practice of covenant advocacy, in which a party with standing before a legal authority presents the case of the one who has been wronged before that authority with the full force of the advocate's legal knowledge, relational standing, and personal investment in the outcome. David is not asking God to sympathize with his situation from a comfortable distance. He is invoking God as his legal advocate, as the specific, personally invested, legally authoritative representative who enters the court on his behalf and presents before every relevant authority the true case of a life that has been falsely characterized, unjustly mocked, and publicly framed by voices whose characterization bears no resemblance to the truth of what the life actually represents and what the God who declared it actually intended for it. When God pleads the cause is presented by the most authoritative advocate available in any court, natural or supernatural, the one who created the life whose cause is being pleaded, who authored the promise that the mocking voice has been ridiculing, who has direct, complete, and perfect knowledge of every element of the truth that the mocking narrative has been suppressing and distorting in every public space where it has been circulating. The pleading of the cause produces something specific and visible, because a legal case presented before an authoritative court produces a verdict. And a verdict rendered by the God who pleads the cause carries into the natural and spiritual dimensions of the public spaces where the mocking voice has been operating the authoritative correction of every false characterization the mocking built. The people whose perception of the targeted person was shaped by the mocking narrative begin to receive through the specific, varied, divinely orchestrated means that God employs when he pleads a cause exposure to the truth that the narrative suppressed. Decisions that were made on the basis of the mocking narrative begin to be reconsidered. Assessments that were formed by the gathered rejoicing of those who predicted the failure begin to be revised in the light of evidence that God is specifically causing to become visible. The cause that was pleaded in the court of heaven begins to be vindicated in the courts of human perception and professional evaluation and relational reassessment, because the God who pleads causes does not plead them only in the spiritual dimension, while leaving the natural dimension to continue operating under the governance of the false narrative that the mocking voice constructed. Fight against those who fight against me, and the transition from the legal language of pleading to the military language of fighting is itself a declaration about the nature of the opposition that the mocking voice represents. Because the mocking is not simply an opinion expressed by individuals whose freedom to assess the visible evidence. E of the life includes the freedom to assess it negatively. It is a force operating against the progress of a God-ordained life, an active, directional, spiritually informed opposition that works against the forward movement of the destiny that God declared by creating the atmospheric and relational and circumstantial conditions in which that movement is most difficult to sustain. The people whose voices carry the mocking are not simply expressing personal opinions. They are, whether they know it or not, serving as instruments of an opposition that is specifically targeting the progress of a calling that the enemy cannot stop through direct confrontation, and is therefore working to arrest through the indirect but devastatingly effective mechanism of sustained mockery that erodes the interior conditions of faith and courage and declaration that the progress depends on. When God fights against those who fight against the progress he ordained, he enters the battle at the level where the opposition is most operative, not simply addressing the external manifestations of the mocking, but dismantling the spiritual forces that have been using the mocking voices as instruments of abroad. Our opposition against the destiny declared. He removes the spiritual support structure from beneath the opposition, changes the atmospheric conditions in which the mockery was most effective, and redirects the momentum that the opposition was maintaining against the progress into a momentum that accelerates the progress past every obstacle the opposition erected. The fighting of God is not a proportional response to the opposition. It is the overwhelming, comprehensive, decisive engagement of the one whose resources for the advancement of what he declared infinitely exceed the resources of every force assembled against it. Take hold of shield and buckler and stand up for my help. The protective engagement of God that positions itself specifically between the mocking voice and the interior of the life it is targeting. The shield and the buckler in the military context of the ancient world were not weapons, they were the equipment of the warrior who placed himself in the path of what was aimed at the person behind him, absorbing the force of the incoming assault on the equipment he was carrying, so that the person he was protecting experienced the engagement without experiencing the full impact of what was aimed at them. The invocation of God taking hold of shield and buckler is the invocation of the God who personally, deliberately, specifically positions his own presence between the mocking voice and the faith of the one being mocked, so that what reaches the interior of the life is not the unmediated force of the mockery, but the filtered, intercepted, substantially diminished force of something that encountered the shield of divine protection before it could reach its intended target. This protective engagement explains something that many believers navigating sustained mockery have experienced without having the framework to fully understand the experience of being in the middle of circumstances that should have been producing a level of discouragement and faith erosion proportional to the magnitude and the sustained intensity of the mocking, and discovering that the interior of the life is holding in a way that the circumstances alone do not account for. The shield is operative. The buckler is in place, and the mocking that was aimed with the precision of someone who knows exactly where the vulnerable points of the interior are is encountering the probe. The protection of the God who positioned himself between the attack and the target before the attack reached the range at which it would have done the damage it was designed to do. Draw out the spear, and this is the offensive movement of the divine engagement that completes the transition from defense to advance. The spear drawn is not a weapon of retaliation deployed in the satisfaction of a wounded person whose desire for revenge has been given divine endorsement. It is the active, personally initiated, sovereignly directed movement of God toward the opposition that has been pursuing the progress he ordained, the engagement of the divine warrior who does not permanently maintain a defensive posture while the opposition continues to mock and pursue and gather against what he declared. There is a moment in the contending of God when the defensive becomes offensive, when the shield and the buckler that have been absorbing the force of the mocking give way to the spear that moves against the source of the mocking, that engages the opposition where it has been most actively operating, and that begins the process of scattering what had gathered and confusing what had confidently predicted, and reversing what had celebrated the arrest of the progress it was watching. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. And this declaration, placed at the end of the military invocation of the opening verses, reveals the deepest intention of everything the divine contending produces. The external silencing of the mocking voice, the legal vindication of the cause that was pleaded, the fighting of the God who fights for what he declared, the protective shield and the offensive spear, all of it ultimately serves this single, most intimate, most personally significant purpose. That in the middle of the battle, the soul that has been targeted by the mocking voice hears directly, personally, unmistakably the voice of the God who is contending on its behalf, declaring what the mocking voice was specifically designed to make impossible to hear. That he is the salvation. That the promise he spoke is not refuted by the gap between its declaration and its current visible manifestation. That the progress he ordained is not subject to the final verdict of the voices that gathered to rejoice at its apparent arrest. That the soul which set its trust on his faithfulness did not trust in vain. And that the contending he is releasing into the battle is the evidence given before the vindication is fully visible, that the faithfulness that was trusted is the faithfulness that will not fail. The mocking gathered, the opposition assembled. The voices rejoice at the stumbling. And the God of Psalm 35, who pleads and fights and shields and advances, has heard every word of it and is arising to answer every word of it with a comprehensiveness and a permanence that the voices of mockery never anticipated when they opened their mouths against the progress of the life he declared. This is the moment of invocation. Everything declared across every section of this message, the nature of the mocking voice and the specific damage it does to the interior conditions that forward movement requires, the comprehensive and militarily precise engagement of the contending God that Psalm 35 releases when that mocking becomes unbearable, has been building toward this single, decisive, faith-activated moment of releasing the full force of what the psalm contains over every voice that has been speaking against the progress of the life and the calling that God declared. Because the silencing against available through Psalm 35 is not activated by the passive reception of its promises, however genuinely those promises are appreciated. It is released through the specific, bold, covenant-grounded invocation of the contending God by a believing child who understands what they are invoking, why they have the authority to invoke it, and what the declaration they are about to release will accomplish in the spiritual and natural dimensions of every arena where the mocking voices have been most active and the damage to the forward movement has been most significant. The invocation is not complicated, but it is specific, and the specificity is everything. A general declaration of God's goodness made in the general direction of a general experience of being mocked leaves the specific dimensions of the mocking unaddressed and therefore still operative. The Psalm 35 invocation that silences the mocking voice and reclaims the arrested progress is the invocation that names what has been gathering, identifies what has been mocking, presents the specific case before the contending God with the particularity of a legal advocate, bringing specific evidence before a specific court, and releases the specific engagements of the psalm over the specific battlefields where the opposition has been doing its most effective work. Begin with the positioning. Before the declaration, before the specific invocations, before the release of what the psalm contains into the spiritual atmosphere of the battle position, the interior. Fix the heart on the God who is being invoked before releasing the invocation, not on the mocking voices, not on the circumstances that the mocking has been using as its primary ammunition, on the God who contends, on the God who pleads the cause, on the God who draws the spear and says to the soul what the soul most needs to hear in the middle of the battle that the mocking produced. Let that positioning be the foundation from which the declaration proceeds, because the declaration released from a heart that is fixed on the contending God carries the authority of someone who knows who they are invoking, while the declaration released from a heart that is still primarily fixed on the mocking voices it is trying to silence carries the uncertainty of someone whose primary attention is on the problem rather than on the one who is greater than the problem. With the heart positioned, release the invocation specifically, boldly, with the full authority of a covenant child who has read Psalm 35 not as historical poetry, but as a living, active, currently available legal and spiritual instrument designed for exactly the battle being fought. Say, Father, in the name of Jesus Christ, I come before you as the contending God of Psalm 35, the God who pleads causes, who fights fights, who takes up shield and buckler and draws the spear on behalf of the covenant child whose ordained progress has been mocked, gathered against, and celebrated in its apparent arrest by voices that never had the authority to declare the outcome of a life and a calling that you declared before any of them spoke a word against it. I invoke your full engagement now, not a general appeal for divine assistance, but the specific, legally and militarily precise engagement that Psalm 35 describes over every dimension of the battle where the mocking voices have been most active and the damage to my forward movement has been most significant. Say, plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive against my progress. Enter the legal dimension of this battle as my advocate present. Hang before every court, natural and supernatural, the true evidence of who I am, what you have called me to, and what the promise you spoke over my life actually declares about the future that the mocking voice has been predicting the failure of. Present the evidence that the mocking narrative has been deliberately suppressing the genuine character, the authentic calling, the real faith, the actual promise that was spoken over this life by the God who does not speak promises He does not intend to keep, and who does not declare callings He does not intend to fulfill. Let your pleading of my cause establish the truth of the life you declared in every context where the mocking narrative has been establishing its counterfeit version of my story in the professional environments, in the social circles, in the relational contexts, In the organizational spaces where my name has been discussed in my absence by voices that were constructing a narrative designed to confirm their prediction of my failure, say, fight against those who fight against my progress. Enter the battle at the level where the opposition against my forward movement has been most operative, not simply addressing the East. External expressions of the mocking, but dismantling the spiritual forces that have been using the mocking voices as instruments of a broader opposition against the destiny you declared over my life. Remove the spiritual support structure from beneath the forces that have been working against the advancement of what you ordained. Change the atmospheric conditions in the environments of my calling that the mockery has been shaping against the possibility of the progress you declared. Redirect the momentum that the opposition has been maintaining against my forward movement into the momentum of a divine acceleration that moves the calling past every obstacle the opposition erected, carrying me not back to where I was before the mocking arrested progress, but forward to where the progress was always designed to arrive, regardless of what the voices gathering against it predicted. Say, take hold of shield and buckler and stand up for my help. Position your presence between the mocking voice and the interior of my life, between what the mockery was aimed at destroying and the faith, the courage, and the willingness to keep declaring what you spoke, that the forward movement of my Kali, NG, requires. Intercept the force of every discouraging declaration before it reaches the interior where it was designed to do its damage. Absorb the impact of every gathered rejoicing, every privately celebrated setback, every publicly expressed doubt about the authenticity of the promise, so that what reaches the faith, sustaining my forward movement, is not the unmediated force of what was aimed at dismantling it, but the filtered, intercepted, substantially diminished force of something that encountered the shield of the living God before it could reach its target. Stand up for my help actively, personally. Specifically in the dimensions of this battle where the mocking has been most effective and the interior of my life has been most vulnerable to the damage it was designed to produce. Say, draw out the spear against those who pursue my progress with the rejoicing of predicted failure. Move offensively, actively, specifically against the opposition that has been tracking the gap between the promise and its current visible manifestation, and using that gap as the primary instrument of the mockery directed against my continued declaration and continued forward movement. The spear drawn by the contending God is not the weapon of my personal revenge against people who have caused me genuine pain through the gathered rejoicing of their private satisfaction in my difficulty. It is the weapon of divine justice moving against the forces, spiritual and natural, that have been pursuing the progress of a calling you declared with the persistent, patient, strategically timed investment of people who believe that if the mocking was sustained long enough and the setbacks were celebrated consistently enough, the declaration would eventually be silenced and the progress would eventually be permanently arrested. Draw the spear, engage the pursuit. And let the forces that have been most confidently gathered against the progress of what you declared encounter the God whose movement against what opposes his declared purposes is as certain as every other demonstration of his faithfulness across the entire history of his engagement with the enemies of what he ordained. Say to my soul, speak directly into the interior of the life the mocking has been most successfully targeting, that you are my salvation. Not that salvation is available somewhere in the distance. The journey continues long enough and the faith holds out sufficiently that you are my salvation personally, presently, immediately operative in the specific dimensions of this battle where the mocking voice has been most loudly arguing that the trust was misplaced and the promise was not what it was declared to be, and the gap between the declaration and the present is the final evidence that the confidence was self-deception. Say to my soul what the mocking voice has been working to make impossible to hear and impossible to believe, that the promise is not refuted by the gap, that the calling is not disqualified by the setback, that the declaration you spoke over this life before any mocking voice had an opinion about it is still the operative declaration, still the word that determines the actual outcome, still the promise that the contending God who spoke it is personally invested in fulfilling, regardless of every voice that gathered to predict its failure. Say, I reclaim my voice. The tongue that retreated from the bold, unqualified, publicly expressed declaration of the promise because the audience of mockers had made the bold declaration feel like the provision of further ammunition to people who were monitoring the gap between the promise and the present for exactly that purpose. That tongue is released now from the self-censorship that the mockery produced. My tongue shall speak of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long. Not the hedged, defensively qualified, apologetically offered declaration of a faith that has been made too self-conscious by the watchers to speak freely, but the full, unashamed, all day long declaration of the God who contended, who fought, who shielded, who drew the spear, who said to the soul what the soul needed to hear, and who is producing from the very setbacks. The mocking voices were celebrating the acceleration toward the fullness of what was declared that the mockery was specifically designed to prevent. Walk out of this declaration and into the forward movement of the calling with a restored confidence of a life that has invoked the contending God and that knows, on the basis of what that invocation releases, that the mocking voices have encountered a force they were never designed to withstand, and that the progress they were celebrating the arrest of is moving again under the pleading of the DI. Divine advocates, under the fighting of the divine warrior, under the shield of the divine protector, under the advance of the drawn spear of the God who does not permanently observe the mockery of his declared purposes from a distance. The voices that gathered will be scattered. The ones who rejoiced at the stumbling will encounter the confusion of people whose confident prediction was wrong. The ones who magnified themselves against the progress will discover that what they were magnifying themselves against was not simply the ambition of a person whose potential they had overestimated. It was the declared purpose of the God who contends for what he declares with a comprehensiveness and a permanence that no gathered mockery has ever successfully resisted across the entire history of his engagement with those who oppose what he ordained. The progress is reclaimed. The voice is restored. The contending God is active. And from this moment forward, the life that the mocking voices gathered against is advancing under the engagement of the God of Psalm 35. With the momentum of a divine vindication that the mockery was powerless to prevent, and with the tongue that was silenced now decal. Erring without apology and without the defensive qualification that the mockery produced the righteousness and the praise of the one who contended and won. He is your salvation. He was always your salvation. He declared the progress before the mocking voices had an opinion about it. And he is still declaring it now louder than every voice that gathered against it, more permanently than every prediction of its failure, more authoritatively than every gathered rejoicing that celebrated its apparent arrest. The contending God has spoken. The progress is moving. The mocking voices have met their match, and the match was never close.